Welcome to the World War II Discussion Forum series. I'm the founder and executive director, Greg McNiff. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the raised hand feature at the bottom of your screen. It's the yellow red hand. Use that. I will call on you to unmute your line and ask you to present your question to our speaker, or you can do the chat feature at the bottom. Just type your question in and I will read it out to our speaker. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking a question. It's always disappointing when we have questions in the queue because we couldn't get to them as we ran out of time. Second, donations always appreciated, not expected. They're on the website, the link wwiidf.org. Third, as I mentioned, we will be recording this talk and posting it to our YouTube channel shortly thereafter. A link to that YouTube channel is available at the top of the website, wwiidf, where you can search for it on YouTube. Fourth and finally, I appreciate any feedback, good, bad, constructive, recommendations, always appreciated. And that link or the email can be found on the website or just replying to my email. More importantly, we're thrilled to have Tobias Straumann today to speak on his book, Out of Hitler's Shadow. Tobias is a professor of modern and economic history at the University of Zurich. He studied in Berkeley, Bielefeld, Paris, and Zurich, and has held visiting positions at the University of Lausanne, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the University of Oxford. He has published widely on the financial and monetary history of the 20th century, including 1931, Debt Crisis and the Rise of Hitler by Oxford University Press. Today, Tobias is going to speak on his latest book, Out of Hitler's Shadow, which explains why the Allies concluded that imposing unrealistic financial conditions on a defeated country would do more harm than good, despite World War II being one of the most atrocious wars of all time. The reviews have been fantastic. I'm just going to quote two briefly from the Financial Times. Out of Hitler's Shadow is a story of risk, courage, and contingency told with verve and vivid details. This well-written book resurrects the important chapter in international history, while the European History Review concludes Out of Hitler's Shadow is a substantial and thoughtful contribution to the history of post-war Europe. It demonstrates with clarity that financial settlements were constructive elements of political order, not administrative afterthoughts. As an account of how Western actors rendered German debt manageable after 1945, it is likely to become a reference point, as well as to advance courses on post-war reconstruction and to improve our understanding of this important time period in history. Many of the other reviews, all of them, in fact, are like that, but I will spare you and Tobias and at this point turn it over to him.
Okay, thanks very much, Greg, for having me. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about 20 to 30 minutes, and I will give you a brief summary of the book and of the major questions that I was trying to answer in the book. As Greg said, my book is about the London Debt Agreement of 1953. It's arguably the biggest international debt settlement in modern European history. I wrote the book because this agreement is not known in the wider public, especially outside of Germany. But I'm Swiss, by the way, so I described it from the outside, from an outside perspective. The book is short and written in a narrative style in order to reach an audience beyond academic circles. I try to achieve two goals: to show the importance of the London Debt Agreement for the economic reconstruction of West Germany and Western Europe, and to give a sense of how difficult it was to reach an agreement. Our picture of the post-war reconstruction is somewhat rosy and simple-minded. All what was needed was a series of measures: the Marshall Plan, the German currency reform, the foundations of the Federal Republic of Germany, European integration, and the emergence of the Cold War basically determined what policymakers had to do to save Western Europe from communism. So why was the London Debt Agreement so important? I think it is fair to say that without the agreement, the German economic miracle would have stalled in the course of the 1950s, and this, in turn, would have hampered the recovery of Western Europe and undermined its political stability as a whole. Some economic historians have tried to measure its effect, and most of them agree that the effect was substantial. How? By settling all pending West German debts and reparation claims against Germany, The agreement ended the period of uncertainty, provided West German companies with access to international capital markets, and paved the way to the restoration of the convertibility of the West German currency, the Deutsche Mark. In short, the London Debt Agreement completed the financial reconstruction of West Germany and Western Europe. To be sure, the Marshall Plan, starting in the late 1940s, had been a crucial step as it pushed the Western European nations to abandon war-related price and wage controls, to liberalize trade among each other, to establish a multilateral clearing mechanism, the so-called European Payments Union, and to restore and modernize their industrial bases. But it was not sufficient. The financial reconstruction was just as important. Given that the issue of debts and reparations is central to the German and European memory of the period after the First World War, it is striking that the same issue is almost entirely absent in the American and European mind when it comes to understanding the reconstruction of Western Europe after the Second World War. One reason for the lack of memory is that the London Debt Agreement succeeded in sustaining the economic recovery. We remember failures much easier than success stories. But that is not an entirely satisfactory explanation, as the agreement was not simply a success story. It was also a highly painful story, producing winners and losers. Furthermore, it was linked to the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, which committed West Germany to pay reparations to Israel and the Claims Conference, an umbrella institution of private Jewish organizations. When dealing with the issue of guilt, it is inappropriate to speak of success. Debt and guilt are closely intertwined, but you cannot settle guilt once and for all by settling debt. Thus, from a moral standpoint, the London Debt Agreement was neither just nor fair. First and foremost, it cancelled all remaining reparation claims against Germany related to World War II by deferring them until a formal peace treaty with a reunited Germany would be concluded. This verdict was hard to swallow as it challenged all conventional notions of justice. Nazi Germany had committed unspeakable crimes, but its successor state, the Federal Republic, received lenient treatment, while those countries which had suffered from the Nazi terror were asked to postpone their claims. The unequal treatment was even more striking as the private holders of German pre-war debts succeeded in securing about half of their claims. Less controversial was that the Federal Republic was obliged to repay about 50% of its post-war assistance, including Marshall Plan funds. Altogether, the fiscal burden for the young republic was light. The German economic miracle continued in the 1950s, and liberated from debt, the West German state was able to expand its role in the economy and the society. The United Kingdom, by contrast, was burdened by public debt for nearly 3 decades after the Second World War, which hampered economic growth and expansion of public investment and services. To provide a sense of the complexity of the task, I start the narrative in the early 1950s when US Secretary of State Dean Acheson gathered his advisors in his office to discuss the next steps regarding the future of West Germany. There was no consensus on how to proceed, and the general feeling was that the Western allies were losing control. I quote Acheson, "We cannot hold our position defensively. We will slip backward. It is therefore necessary to find some new idea or new step which will regain the initiative. The economic incentives, which were the basis of the Marshall Plan, seem to have lost their vitality, and we are engaged in discussions of such things as the payments union. While this is no doubt of some importance, the successful working out of a payments union will have no popular appeal. There will be no holidays or torchlight parades in celebration of a payments union." End of quote. Western diplomats and policymakers needed to fix 3 problems: West German sovereignty, the security of Western Europe, and the settlement of German debt and reparations. Everything depended on everything else. It was like a three-dimensional chess game. To make things more complicated, the Israeli government and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, short claims conference, representing the world's Jewish interests, put their claims at the table once the London Debt Conference started in early 1952. Now the game became four-dimensional, so to speak, because the question of German guilt now became part of the final stage of the post-war settlement. It led to an intense fight between two German delegations. The one in London wanted to keep German payments as low as possible to minimize the fiscal burden. The one in Wassenaar, near The Hague, wanted to be generous vis-à-vis Israel and the Claims Conference, to give the right signal to the surviving Jewish communities, to Israel, and the global public opinion. The Truman administration, in turn, was concerned that a generous gesture towards Israel and the private creditors holding German pre-war debt would ultimately result in a higher bill for Washington, as West Germany still depended on American money and credit. Ultimately, they found a solution, but the process was on a knife edge until the very end. The struggle was particularly fierce in Israel. The Israeli population was split with regard to reparations from West Germany. The debate in the Knesset in January 1952 lasted several days and was extremely heated. Opposition leader Menachem Begin mobilized his supporters and held an offending speech in the Knesset. I quote Begin: "I know you have power. You have jails, concentration camps." He's speaking to Ben Gurion, to the prime minister. "I know you have power. You have jails, concentration camps, an army, police, secret police, artillery, machine guns. No matter. On this issue, all that power will shatter like glass against a rock. For a just cause, we will fight to the end. In these cases, physical force is worthless. It is utter nonsense. I am warning, but not threatening. Who can I threaten? I know that you will drag us into concentration camps. Today you have arrested hundreds. Perhaps you will arrest thousands. No matter. They will go, they will be imprisoned. We shall be imprisoned with them. If there is a need, we shall be killed with them. And there will be no reparations from Germany. And God help us to avoid this Holocaust for the sake of our future and our honor." End of quote. Demonstrators protested against direct contact with the successor country of Nazi Germany and threw stones through the windows of the Knesset. The deputies had to leave the room to be protected against the riots. Eventually, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion prevailed narrowly and could start negotiations. Chancellor Adenauer, he was the Chancellor and Foreign Minister of West Germany, had less trouble convincing his cabinet to start negotiations with Israel. But there was opposition, notably from the Finance Ministry for budgetary reasons. In the end, Adenauer won the argument. In the Bundestag, however, he could pass the Luxembourg Agreement only thanks to the opposition, the Social Democrats. There were many other events making the negotiations more complicated. In June of 1950, the Korean War broke out, which weakened the Truman administration, especially after the dismissal of the highly popular Douglas MacArthur in April of 1952. In late 1950 and early 1951, it's completely unknown to the public, the Federal Republic of Germany suffered from an existential balance of payments crisis, which led to a serious conflict between Chancellor Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, the Minister of Economic Affairs. Adenauer wanted to fire Erhard and failed only because the financial crisis ended at the right moment in the spring of 1951. There were also several terrorist attacks on Israeli interlocutors because they were considered traitors. And there was even a terrorist attack on Adenauer. There are quite a lot of people think that the early 1950s were a quiet time. Or even a boring time, because compared to the Second World War and to the turbulent 1960s. But I can assure you that this impression is misleading. And my book is an attempt to provide evidence for a more realistic memory of that period. I thank you very much for your attention.
Hey, thank you very much, Tobias. We have a few questions in the queue already. The first one from Charles. According to Thomas E. Dewey in his book Journey to the Far East, published in 1952, the Philippines wanted $8 billion of reparations from Japan. Have you or anyone else done research on reparations from Japan?
I think there is a lot of research, but I'm not as familiar with the Japanese situation as with the German situation. All I know that the United States was even more lenient towards Japan. And the reason was that the United States was the only country occupying Japan. So they had more power to, follow through on their plan to reconstruct Japan as quickly as possible. And I think in the case of Germany, you have several stages which were absent in Japan. In Germany, first, there was the cooperation with the Soviet Union, and it collapsed in the course of 1946.
Mm,
And then they always had to talk to the UK and France, and especially the UK was in such a bad shape financially and economically that the US had to agree that West Germany paid some of the money back spent for the occupation.
mm.
And in Japan, that was not necessary. And but I'm sure they paid even less than Germany.
Interesting. I want to take one or two more from the queue, and then we'll go to Jim, Mike, and Mark. Excuse me. Uh, Charles asked, how did Adenauer manage to negotiate debt relief while simultaneously negotiating reparations for Israel, two processes that were deeply in tension with each other?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key questions of the book, because that's always with debt settlements. You have different groups of creditors, and they're playing games.
Yeah.
And of course, they know if that happens, I can do this, and you're yeah, you're forging alliances. I think I'm not telling everything because that's a really important part of the book, how it goes back and forth. I think Adenauer had two teams that were competing with each other, and they let them compete with each other.
Mm,
But there was a certain stage where he lost control, and that led to a real crisis. It was in May of 1952, so about 3 months after the start of the conferences. And then he had to make a 180, and he had to endorse the German delegation talking to the Israeli, while the other delegation was put back in its box. But I'm not. That's really very interesting. But I'm not going to reveal the whole story. It's actually very very complicated. It's like a big drama.
mm,
But in the end, they were quite generous towards Israel, uh, and they had to, agree to a compromise with the private creditors at the
mm,
London Debt Conference.
mm. Brian asked about a secret meeting in Paris, which you talk about in your book as part of the negotiating process. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that was the first meeting between Adenauer and an Israeli delegation, and it was not the atmosphere was not very positive, especially the Israeli side was very critical and skeptical of Adenauer. But nevertheless, it was a crucial meeting and it started the negotiating process. But the process, again, that's a very interesting story and fascinating. So it was kept secret for quite a long time. It took about, yeah, many months until they dared going public with the negotiations. But it was very important, the secret meeting it was in April of yeah, in April of 1951, and there was another one in London. So it took a long time.
Mm. Chris asks, how do you credit the debt settlement versus the Marshall Plan for explaining the Wirtschaftswunder wonder, or the I guess the
Yeah,
recovery of, yeah, repayment and
yeah,
recovery, yeah.
yeah. That's a great question. As I indicated, I think you needed both. So to make it simple, I would say the Marshall Plan was about economic reconstruction in the sense that it was more about trade, it was more about price controls, wage controls. You have to imagine after the Second World War, this old European division of labor was completely broken. And the Marshall Plan was very important in restoring this old division of labor. It was not so much about providing money. The money was only the leverage to force the European nations or the West European nations to liberalize their trade and to liberalize their domestic economy. So I think the Marshall Plan was really important for that stage. But the financial side was always postponed. They had been talking about reparations right after the war. There was a first smaller reparation agreement in 1946, but they always thought, let's just start with trade and all that. And then in the end, we will talk about reparations. But they were waiting so long that then Israel was founded actually in 48, excuse me. And then it became very complicated.
Mm.
But it was always a two-stage process. And I think you needed both elements because if you don't have a financial reconstruction, and a restoration of open financial markets, of convertibility of the currency, you cannot grow in a sustained way. And so
Mm.
that's why I would say first economic reconstruction, Marshall Plan, then financial reconstruction, London Debt Agreement.
Fascinating. One more in the queue. Did Germany pay any reparations to any of the Soviet occupied or dominated countries, either post-war or today? For example, Poland never received reparations.
Yes, well, Poland is a tragic case because Poland was forced by the Soviet Union in 1953 to, how do you say, restrain from all reparation claims. And the reason was, of course, the Soviet Union wanted to have all reparation payments from East Germany. And so they had no intention to divide the share with Poland, you know.
Mm.
And they had to sign a document that they would never raise claims from East Germany. And that's basically still the document that's important. But that's not the fault of the US or the Western powers. And that's one reason, and together with the Cold War, that Poland never received any money from West Germany. But then in the 1990s, there was enormous pressure international, especially from the US, on the reunited Germany to do something for this forced labor
Mm.
people and their children, and that's where Germany paid some compensation to Polish families. But it's true, and that's the reason why Poland is still raising reparation claims now, because they think they didn't get what they deserve to get. And there is I mean, morally they're right. Poland was probably the country that had suffered most from Nazi terror. But on the other hand, strictly legal point of view would emphasize that yeah, well, they were not part of the London Debt Agreement, and
Yeah.
but it's that's very interesting to think about. You know, how do you make peace? And you can never be fair to everybody. That's I think that's the hard lesson. And even at the time, we look back and we think there was a splendid, fantastic relationship between the United States and Europe, or especially Western Europe, and kind of the pivot, the best time of transatlantic alliance. But even at that time, you had winners and losers, and supporting West Germany meant that the others didn't get any money, and that makes it very fascinating, but also painful to think about how you can make peace after such a horrible war.
Yeah, I'll take one more from the queue and then Jim, Mike, and Mark, I'll go to you. Aaron says, thank you, Dr. Straumann. Great lecture. Can you discuss how the German compensation to Israel in the 1950s and 60s was structural to Israeli industrial expansion and development of trade, industrial development, and sectors that Germany was strongest in?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, that's very important. For the Germans, for the West Germans, it was not that much money actually, and I provide figures in the book that shows that they could easily pay that. What's very important for Israel was at the time two things. First, they needed investment goods, and that's of course that was a sector in which the West Germans were very strong. So they delivered a lot of goods, not so much money. So and they agreed on what kind types and of goods the Germans were providing help to the Israeli, and that was very important for the development of Israel. Then the second issue that was really more urgent was that Israel was at the time just um, shortly ahead of a huge energy crisis. They were buying oil from British Petroleum and they needed pound sterling to pay for that, but they had been running out of foreign exchange reserves, so they didn't have any money to pay for oil. And the Germans had at that time a surplus with Great Britain, and they could provide these sterling balances, and that was absolutely crucial in the short term. And I think, and just imagine, I mean, Israel was founded and had this huge inflow of immigrants, no infrastructure, no hospitals, no schools, no roads, so they needed a lot of investment, and even though, as I said, for Germany it was not that much, for Israel it was absolutely vital
Mm,
in the early 1950s. Over time, then it became less important as Israel had an impressive economic growth.
mm. Okay, Jim, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you. It sounds like a really fascinating book. Um, I was curious about your thoughts about how they were constructing in the post-war world a political economy that would take in consideration the issue of revangism that one could see in all the disputes about reparations in the 20s. Young and Dawes and all that,
Right.
and how they wanted to not make that mistake again in the post-war period. Now, years ago, I sat and looked through all the documents that had to do with the Marshall Plan, the actual planning documents. And it was obvious to me that, of course, it's in America's self-interest to stabilize the economy of Germany and other countries like that. So the issue of self-interest is also very much in there in this equation, even though multilateralism would be celebrated, because here we're coming out of World War II with multilateralism being, even with all its stresses, being the source of victory in a way. And then, of course, today we're facing all this craziness we see in the world. But yes, the revangism thing to me, I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for the question. Well, first of all, I think I also write this in the book. The most important difference is, of course, that the United States and the Western allies occupied West Germany. I mean, that was the problem after the First World War. United States didn't have the will or the power, or Great Britain and France didn't have the power uh, and the patience to occupy Germany. And then, as you know, the Germans thought, well, we didn't really we hadn't lost the war really, and that was one of the main reasons why they thought it was realistic to go for revisionist policies. So that's a really big difference. But secondly, there were still very strong, not maybe not revanchist feelings in the German population, but many people thought that the United States were not fair, that they were staying for too long a time. And you see it changes quite quickly. I mean, already in the late 40s, The Germans think the United States that they're not with us, they're against us. And I also cite a lot of people and I cite a lot of polls, and that's really very sobering how they also think about the Nazi past, about the need to provide reparations to the Jews. So it's really sobering. So that's why I said we have our picture is a bit too rosy. But I think the occupation is the most important thing, and then of course self-interest is very important. Uh, but but maybe it's I would have to give a very long answer to answer everything of your question. But I think the third point, which I can confirm, is that they really learned from history. Some historians say it was just the Cold War, self-interested in the Cold War, basically predetermined how policymakers, especially U.S. policymakers, had to proceed. But I don't think that's true. It's maybe even the other way around. The Cold War was kind of a product of the kind of reconstruction they were shaping in the late 90, yeah, in the late 1940s. And also I think Cold War is a structure that means you have certain constraints and you have certain incentives, but you still have various options. You still could have done it differently. And and I end the book with quotes from the Senate debate that was in the summer of 1953. That was really the final ratification of the London Debt Agreement, and there the chairman of the committee clearly says we don't want to have another Versailles. So they were really aware of what was at stake, and I think and I think they were really learning from history, because these people who were responsible, they were all older than 40 or 50, so they knew from their own experience how this international order collapsed in the interwar years. So I think it's easier to learn from history when you have gone through the failure. It's hard to learn from history when you have to pass it from one generation to the other, because the next generation then thinks, well, it's okay what the old people tell us, but we are more intelligent, we know how to do it. But when you have seen with your own eyes how it just didn't work, then I think you can learn from history.
Yeah, ain't that the truth? Thanks.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting, very important topic. And you did a great job. The
Thanks.
the There's two questions actually. The first one would be it would seem, I mean, the obvious answer, the most popular reason given for the rebuilding of Germany is, of course, that it would be a bulwark against the Soviet Union in particular, because the Soviet Union had a more heavy-handed occupation of the territories under its control. So, I mean, would that be the idea to build a German economic miracle? Would be that the plan was so that Germany, without having to have a heavy foot in Germany on the part of the Western Allies, would allow Germany to build itself up to be a bulwark? In other words, was it more political? And the second question has to do with the moral obligations, something that went beyond the financial. In other words, the obligations for, let's say, Germany to be obliged to support, let's say, support Israel, to fight anti-Semitism, and in general, to make sure that never, no, to use the phrase in this sense, never again would Germany resort to anything approaching Nazism. So that, in other words, would that be part of the settlement, or something that may make up for the, let's say, the dearth of financial reparation, so that there would be a political will on the part of Germany to on these moral issues? Sorry if I wasn't
Right.
clear.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the questions. I don't know the first one, absolutely, bulwark. I absolutely agree. But again, that the goal was probably quite clear. But still, you have to forge alliances. You have to do the right thing, in the sense that it really works. Because after the First World War, it was also clear that you needed to build a stable international order, and you had to deal with a very big country, with Germany. And I think there were many people who had really good intentions and plans, but in the end, it just didn't work. So having a clear goal doesn't mean that you're doing the right thing. And there were many different interests. And for instance, the French, they had no interest in reinvigorating West Germany, because that was the dilemma. If you build up Germany too quickly and you give them full sovereignty, you cannot be sure that they will rearm again, like after the First World War. So that's also a dilemma with reparations. If you punish them, they're not able to pay them back. But if you don't punish them, they think you know, there was nothing, So it's a real dilemma. That's what I try to describe. It's bulwark, yes, but what does it mean when you have to take practical decisions and to convince people that this is the right thing? But I absolutely agree with you that that was a very important goal. It was ultimately political, and the economic recovery was kind of an instrument to stabilize Western Germany politically, domestically, and also foreign policy in terms of foreign policy. Second question, I wouldn't say it was to fight anti-Semitism. It was more of a signal and the acknowledgement that the Holocaust had been the responsibility of the German government, Nazi government, but also of the people. It was just the first step. But as I indicated in an earlier answer, it was not clear. Adenauer was impressive. He knew that there was a lot of opposition in the cabinet, in his own party, and in the public at large. And he thought it was absolutely vital just to make this step to signal that this is another Germany than the one during the war. But I don't think they went as far as saying we will never do it again. It was just to signal we understand what we did. And afterwards, there were many other steps and decisions to sustain this transformation. And then it took a while. That had more to do with domestic politics. That over time, then Germany more and more they really confronted this past. But in the early 50s, that was not I think that's my interpretation, was not the most important motivation to do it.
Did the educational system figure into that?
Yeah, but it took a while, and it was not just the educational system, it was then especially the judicial system. The relatively young lawyers, attorneys, state attorneys, they were very courageous. And in the late 50s, early 60s, you had some spectacular trials way before the generation of 68. Actually, that was not so important, 68. And then, of course, the late 70s, as you probably remember, is this TV series Holocaust. That was very important for the domestic German discussion, because now they were not talking about the Nazis, but now they were talking about the victims themselves as human beings, as families and all that. And that was a further step towards acknowledging anti-Semitism and all that kind of thing. But in the early 90s, just when you look at the polls, I was struck how incredible, how little self-criticism there was, and how little acknowledgement that the Jews deserved compensation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks, Mike. Mark, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. This was interesting, particularly that there were extremists in Germany who attacked Adenauer, and that there were people in Israel who threw bricks into the windows of the Knesset, not wanting this. I'm one. My question is maybe a bit raison d'etat, cynical. I wonder if one of the motivations for Adenauer, who I believe I believe he was anti-Semitic, to my knowledge. But I wonder if one of the motivations for Adenauer would have been to kind of wash his hands or make West Germany have clean hands in the sense because and in a convenient way just to pay Israel because that's paying the state where a lot of the survivors went of the Holocaust, but it completely ignores the vast majority, I mean, the 6 million who died in Poland and in France and Ukraine and Russia, Belarus, and every Baltic states. It all ignores all of that, which is a much bigger number. And I wonder if that was a motivation for Adenauer. And my second question is, why such reluctance on the part of the Israelis? Was that aspect of, like, oh, you're just going to pay us also part of their reluctance as opposed to just dealing with the successor state of Nazi Germany?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, starting with the second question, that's exactly right. They just thought we can never talk to them again, and we don't want to, as you said, start a kind of a process of reconciliation with these people. This is just not possible after all what had happened, that. And I didn't know that, but there were really 50%, and also in the cabinet, I cite two ministers. They were part of the religious parties. They were completely against ever talking to Germany, ever even to import goods from Germany. Exactly for the reason, you can never. This had been so horrendous. You can never pardon these people. As for the first question, I think it's a bit more complicated. First, I have to correct my statement. I think it was a misunderstanding. There were also Israeli terrorists trying to kill Adenauer because
Oh, not German ones.
yeah. I'm sorry,
Oh,
I didn't explain that clearly enough. No, all the terrorist attacks came from extremist Jewish groups against their own delegation and against Adenauer because they knew that Adenauer was the main force behind the talks from the German side. And I'm not, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but the way how I describe Adenauer in the book and what I read about him, no, I don't think he was anti-Semitic. I think, and he was a victim of the Nazi regime.
oh yeah,
He
very
he
much so.
was he was caught twice. The second time in prison, he was almost killed. I think one son helped him to get away. His wife was also incarcerated and died about 2 years after the First World War, suffering from the consequences of this prison treatment. I think I don't know whether she was mistreated or not, but she was had been severely ill since being in prison. And when Adenauer, I think it was sincerely convinced that Germany had made a had committed horrible crimes. I think that was sincere. The problem for him was um, uh, whom to blame. And there, I think he was very opportunistic. He just blamed the Nazi regime and said the people were not responsible for that. But that was the only way to move forward with this issue. Later on, you could say there is some collective guilt, but after the Second World War, it was very hard to express this in public. So there he was opportunistic, I think, and the first as you say, the first compensations were clearly confined to Israel and Jews with German affiliation, and it was not paid to to everybody. That's absolutely right. Later on, it became that the payment became more liberal, but in the beginning it was not a huge sum paid out to Jews outside of Israel, or that's true. But I think last point I think maybe interesting. The Adenauer was absolutely critical of all these Nazi guys working for him, but he's saying very clearly, I need them, but I will never let them become politicians. They can work in the top level of the administration, but they will never have the possibility to have real political power. So there was some kind of division of labor. You can do stuff, you can have your job, your career, but you will never have any political influence. And then there you find a lot of quotes where he's he's so realistic. I mean, he doesn't tell the people, well, they were young during the Nazi regime. They didn't know what they did. That no, he's absolutely clear about the moral condemnation of these people, but he was very pragmatic in this sense that he said we cannot rebuild our country without them. And I think he was probably right. You can discuss about individual cases and disagree, I guess, but it reminds me a little bit of the reconstruction of Iraq. The Americans just dismissed all the administration of the Ba'ath regime. Well, then they were all against you afterwards, and I think that would have happened in West Germany as well if you had expelled all officials from the Nazi regime. You would have had a very strong political opposition. And so you could provide them with some perspective, but they didn't play an important political role.
If I could rephrase the first question a little bit, what was it more succinctly? Was there any sense of practicality in just paying off Israel because it's easy? It's an easy target or not target, but it's like you send it to the just to the you have one entity to pay as opposed to 6 million entities,
Right. Yeah,
so to
yeah.
speak. Was that practicality of it? So, like, oh, we can easily, this will help us wash our hands, but it will be easy to do.
Yeah,
Was that part of it?
yeah, but I think it's a bit exaggerated to wash off your hands, because the feeling when we have very we have documents and the conversations between Adenauer and the Israeli foreign minister who signed the Luxembourg Agreement. There's no feeling of now it's over, we did our not at all.
No, it was
It
a lot
was
more to do. Sure,
Yeah, it
sure.
was just like kind of a first step, and
Yeah,
also the
yeah.
feeling you could never make it forget. You can never compensate. You can never get rid
No,
of
I
the
agree.
guilt.
No.
I think at least Adenauer was never feeling that way. And but it's true, it was not a very broad, it was not a generous step, but it was a first. But wash. I don't think that's
No,
the right.
I
Yeah,
I didn't
yeah,
mean to put the emphasis on that.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Only the aspect of it being a practical,
yeah.
easier
That's
way
true.
to do it.
That's true. Of course, you could talk to a government, but also you had this claims conference, and that were about 20 20 private Jewish organizations, U.S. organizations, and they also paid $500 million to those organizations. So there was some attempt to go beyond Israel, but Israel was, of course, the main partner in this negotiation process, and it was also a question of practicality. Yeah,
Thank you very much. I took too much time. Thanks.
yeah. No, no, me too. Thank you.
You guys are both good. Brandon, I'll go to you, and then Victor, I'll go to you. I know you also put your question in the chat, and if you want, I can read it out. Brandon?
Yeah, thank you. I hadn't planned to say this, but the prior conversation just reminded me of something. When I was growing up, and I'm talking about back in the 70s. I remember when a friend of mine's father, I mean, the family was Jewish, as a sign of success at a certain point, he went out and bought a Mercedes, and it threw the local community into an uproar in the United States because,
Uh,
there were people who were saying, you're going to send profits and money to the people who, yada, yada, yada. And they've never repaid us. They still have our, this, that, paint, everything. And, it was a very emotional thing. I mean, the guy really opened a hornet's nest when he did that. So the world has changed considerably, obviously. But my question is around, I was struck by what you said about, there's feeling the Americans were being tough on the Germans, the occupation, and stayed too long and everything. I was just curious, were there differences in class responses or different segments of German society to things like the Marshall Plan, or the Berlin airlift, things that were very sort of publicly, or was there a feeling that, well, they're all doing this for their self-interest anyway?
yeah, thank you very much. First remark, very interesting, but it fits well to the yes to what I read about Germany, post-war Germany. Um, it's hard. I don't hard, I cannot answer it as you maybe like it, class specific. I don't know, but I think it's more a time thing, In 19 the Berlin airlift starts with the German currency reform in 48. That starts in, yeah, 48, and it's very popular. I mean, at that time the Americans were very popular, and at the Marshall Plan as well. At least the launching of the Marshall Plan was very popular in Germany. I think between 48 and then 49, when the Federal Republic was founded, I think the feeling of the West Germans was, now we have our state back. We should have our sovereignty back as quickly as possible. I think that was the time when there was a shift of opinion and the feeling it's taking too long. But it's a class thing. I'm not sure. I think the elite was very became very critical of especially the conservative elite became very critical of the Americans. And I cite an important columnist of the Frankfurter Allgemeine, who at the time was a conservative newspaper, and he said, again, it's like after World War One, that the Americans take off our factories, they take away our patents, they don't give us what we deserve. We have been waiting and doing everything for them. I think it was more a time thing, and the foundation of the government, of the country. And you also see it, how that's well described in the literature, how the Nuremberg process actually they stop in 49, and the the sentences for this former Nazi officials are being lowered, and they can leave prison earlier as they thought, and actually John McCloy, the High Commissioner of Germany, also adapts a little bit to this domestic public opinion. And you probably know the big story with Krupp, the son of Krupp, who was not actually, he was not the main culprit he was kind of a second-rate son. He was not so much responsible for what Krupp had done during the World War, but he was released earlier, and then there was a lot of pushback, but the German public was endorsing such steps. So, but in a way, it's clear after 4 years of occupation, you start to think, hey, let's move on. But I think it has more to do with that than with class-specific um, attitudes. But of course, the political elite, of course, wanted to have more sovereignty, and they still felt humiliated.
Thank you. Yeah, I've read The Arms of Crook by William Manchester, so I know what you're talking about. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. I hope could provide some answer to your question.
Thank you, Brandon. Jim Dingman notes the assassination of 52 against Adenauer was done by former members of the Irgun. Menachem Begin authorized it, and those facts were suppressed at the time due to issues that did relate to anti-Semitism. The connection did not come out until after his death. Okay, Victor,
Thanks.
if you should be able to unmute your line. Like I said, I can read your question if you're not able to.
Hey, basically, I have a comment. My mother was eligible for compensation, but it was such a hassle to get it, it almost proved impossible. Meanwhile, members of the SS and Nazi Party were able to get their Social Security. Um, Under the Totalization Act, they even could get it while they were living in the United States. You can comment on that if you like. My main question is, could you speculate as to why there were no significant war crime trials or tribunals against the Italian war criminals, and related, why the United Nations War Crimes Commission files were sealed by the United States?
Thank you very much. It's very interesting remark. No, I'm not commenting on that, but it confirms that, yeah, public opinion shifted in Germany, and that there was not a absolutely fair and optimal way, optimal policy. That absolutely. Um, Italy, maybe, I don't know, but maybe it has to do with the fact that in the end, the Italian forces fought for their country, even if it was very late, and even if it was only after the Allies had conquered Sicily. Whereas in Germany, there was nothing. There was just absolutely no popular uprising, and it was just this July 1944 to try to kill Hitler, but that's it. Maybe it has to do with that. Same with France. The French fought against the Germans, and even though they would never have succeeded in reconquering the country, they contributed to retaking the country. I think that it may have to do with that. And as for your last point, I don't know. I really don't know. You
There were
you
about
know
30,000 known or accused war criminals, and the United Nations had these files. They could have pursued it, and for some reason they were sealed for, I think, sometime into the 60s or 70s. Um, I don't know what possible reason there was to do that.
well,
So it was a cover
normalizing.
up.
Yeah, normal. I think also from the American side, in the late 40s, early 50s, they wanted to normalize relations with Germany as soon as possible. Maybe also fostered by the Korean War starting in June of 1950, because the Americans then were interested in German coal and steel for the war, and actually, the Pentagon in 1950 wanted West Germany to join NATO as quickly as possible, and then the French came up with this idea of a European defense community, and the Americans then agreed. But in the end, the French themselves buried this plan, and in 54, and then West Germany joined NATO. So the Americans were really interested in normalizing relations very quickly. I would say starting in 1950 with, yeah, Korean War and other things.
Well, normalizing is one thing, but there was a Gladio organization in Italy. There was
Yes.
like an underground organization, and what I wondered if there was an equivalent sort of group in Germany, like
No,
a ultra-right underground organization. But
no,
that's a
no.
topic for much longer discussion.
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't think so. I never stumbled across that. And that's the other amazing thing. No German fought against the Nazis, but after the defeat, there was nothing like that. There was no underground resistance, as far as I know. That would be new to me, but I don't know everything, to be honest. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Victor. Tobias, I know you're joining us from Geneva, but do you have time for one or two more?
Sure, Zurich.
Perfect. Yeah. Vincent, West Germany regained broad sovereignty and joined NATO in May of 55. Can you discuss that debate with the leaders?
Yeah, as I indicated, the Pentagon wanted West Germany earlier, and the the French first came up with the idea of the Schuman Plan, which was kind of the beginning of European integration. And that worked quite well because the Germans were really enthusiastic about um, having a common organization for the heavy industry. And then the French also tried it for defense, but they ultimately failed. But for the Americans, it was very clear in the early 1950s when they realized that Adenauer was a reliant partner, that sooner or later Germany would join NATO and would have its own army. And I think the Cold War was, of course, very important for that decision. But there was quite a strong confidence because Adenauer won the elections in 1953 very clearly. And from then on, it was clear that German democracy worked and there were stable minorities and stable majorities. And he looked like a very reliable guy. And I think so the Americans thought, well, we can now take the next step and normalize also the defense sovereignty of Germany. Is that what the question was about? Or?
Yeah, I think so. Just trying
Yeah.
to understand the
Yeah.
debate around West German, yeah, admission into NATO. A few questions about the 40% haircut reduction to the pre-war debt. Obviously, Versailles was in the background for that discussion, but they didn't want to err on, being so stringent. But how was that number arrived at, or what kind
Yeah.
of debate? Yeah.
Yeah, it was not just it's very complicated. You have about 200 types of debts. Now it's horrible, and it was really hard to write the book taking care of that issue. There were two reparation loans. Maybe you remember the first one was the DAS loan or the DAS bond, and the second one was the Young bond. And these bonds provided foreign exchange reserves to Germany, which they could then use to transfer their reparation payments. They always need foreign exchange to transfer these reparation payments. So that was a large part, but it was not even half of it. And there was a huge Swedish loan from Ivar Kreuger, who was a big financier in the mid in the 1920s, who then went bankrupt and committed suicide. But that was an important part of it. And then on top of that, Weimar Republic was heavily indebted to Wall Street banks, to banks in the city of London, also to Swiss banks or Swedish, Dutch banks, but mostly to American and English creditors. And that was a huge part. And these people, of course, these creditors, they were right in saying, hey, you have to pay this back. And in the beginning, right after the end of World War II, the Americans were not interested in dealing with these creditors. But after a year, yeah, they changed to they start to change their opinion, and then they start to negotiate with these people. And I think the most important reason is that they were very well organized in London as well as in Washington, and there were important people around, among them, so that you could not really ignore their claims. And that's how they were included in the final agreement, and it was about 50% haircut.
Hmm.
And that's just the result of going back and forth. And the Truman administration always argued that we are reducing our claims regarding post-war debt, Marshall Plan and all that, by 50%, so you have to follow us.
Hmm.
That was kind of a very clever move because the Americans always put the post-war debt as a senior debt. So they always had the control about these debt negotiations. They could always argue, we are doing that, and we expect you do you do that. If you don't follow us, we're not gonna reduce our debt, and then you're not gonna get anything. So that was a very clever way to discipline those private creditors. But
Hmm.
you had to make a compromise. And actually, as I write in the book, at the very end, the American bondholders, they revolt against almost final agreement in London. And then Acheson said, okay, if you want to get a little bit more, okay, here it is. But it was actually the American taxpayer who had to pay it, because then the Americans reduced their claims regarding post-war debt a little bit. And in the Senate, you had some senators who were saying, what the hell is going on? We have to reduce our claims, which in the end, the American taxpayer has to pay. And these private creditors, they get all what they want, you know.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the majority of the Senate was clearly for the compromise suggested by Acheson.
Perfect. Last question, and we got a few on these. I want to get the economics here. Why was tying debt repayment to export production so key?
Oh, excuse me, I didn't
Yeah,
understand.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Why was tying debt repayment to Germans' export production, to exports, so important?
Oh, that because you need to have when you transfer reparations, you have to have two surpluses. You have to have a fiscal surplus and a trade surplus, because otherwise you cannot transfer your fiscal surplus to the creditors, because they want it in their currency, or in dollars or in gold, but not in German currency. That was the main problem after the First World War. Germany had to have two surpluses. They didn't have a trade surplus because the other countries were very protectionist after the First World War. And then during the Great Depression, that really killed Germany, because they had to come up with this double surplus, and that was horrible in terms of economic policies.
Excellent. That concludes our lecture for today. Again, the book is Out of Hitler's Shadow, Debt, Guilt, and the German Economic Miracle by Tobias Straumann. Next week, historian Kevin Heimel will speak on Patton's War and American Generals Combat Leadership, Volume 1, November 42 through July 44, which relies on new sources unavailable to previous historians and through extensive research of soldiers' memoirs and interviews. The author adds a new dimension to the telling of Patton's World War II story, which I'm sure will be fascinating given the previous lectures we've had on Patton. Tobias, thank you so much today. That was really a great discussion. Highly recommend the book. And yeah, we'd love to have you back for the
Yeah.
next one.
Let's see. Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. I didn't answer maybe everything, but I hope it was an interesting discussion for you as well. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Take care.
Take care. Bye.